So far, we've been talking about how we can write next-strain narratives that are sourcing data from previously published next-strain builds, like this one. But in practice, you're going to want to perform your own next-strain analyses, and you'll want to upload the corresponding data to a place where nextstrain.org can load those data and display them to other people. Nextstrain's community interface, which is what we're using to serve our narratives, can also be used to serve datasets, also called nextstrain builds. You can create your own builds locally on your machine, and you can upload those builds to GitHub and source those builds through the nextstrain.org community interface. So next we're going to look at how would we do this with an existing JSON file that corresponds to a single SARS-CoV-2 analysis. And you can follow the same practice for any JSON files that you have locally on your machine. As an example, we're going to start with a phylogenetic tree that was built early on in the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic that consists of 164 genomes. We'll download the corresponding auspice JSON file for this tree and show how to load it onto GitHub, and then access it through the community interface. To start with, we need to get the JSON file for this tree. This JSON file is sourced through a URL at data.nextstrain.org, and we can change these forward slashes to underscores, and then at the end of the URL put JSON. This will download the corresponding JSON file that's loaded into that nextstrain view. And depending on your browser, this may look a little different in Chrome or Brave or other browsers. Working from Firefox, we can click Save here. And we're going to save this file to a file name with a prefix that matches the repository that we're working from. Just like in our narratives, we need to have each file that wants to be served from the community interface prefixed by the name of the repository that we're working from. So here we'll call the file nextstrain narratives demo and then the original file name. We can save this file, and this will download it to our local machine. If you're working from Chrome, you may see the file show up like this, in which case you'll need to right-click and select Save As to download the file. We can now return to our nextstrain narratives repository and go to the top level of the repository. To host nextstrain builds from a GitHub repository, we need to create a directory called auspice. So nextstrain.org knows to pull these data from this repository. In the same way that narratives is a keyword for auspice or for nextstrain.org, the auspice directory name is a keyword for nextstrain.org. To create this new directory, we have to first create a placeholder file inside that directory. So we'll select Add File, Create New File, and then we'll type auspice/readme.md. This will be a placeholder for our auspice JSONs. Auspice JSONs live here. We'll scroll down, and we'll commit this new file. In doing so, we've created a new directory called auspice in this top level repository. Now we can go to Add File and upload files. We can drag files from Finder or from your Internet Explorer, your Explorer interface, or you can choose your files through an upload interface. In this case, I'll drag on this JSON file. And before I do, I want to note that this is a 512 kilobyte file. GitHub has an upper limit of 25 megabytes for any file uploads through their drag and drop interface. And in practice, most of your nextstrain auspice JSONs will be larger than this 25 megabyte limit. This means that you'll need to upload your files through a different GitHub client, like the Git command line interface, GitHub's GUI interface, Git Kraken, or any other similar client. So for now, I can drag this relatively small file onto my interface here. GitHub uploads it, and I can click Commit Changes to save my changes. Now I can see that I have my auspice directory. When I select the auspice directory, I find the JSON file that I just uploaded with the appropriate name prefixed by the repository name. And when I select this file, I can see that it has the corresponding JSON content. Now that we've uploaded a nextstrain auspice JSON, we can view this JSON through the nextstrain.org interface that will be sourcing from this GitHub repository. We'll notice that we named this analysis JSON file with a prefix that matches the repository name, and then the name of the file continues on to what will be displayed in the nextstrain.org URL. We've seen this pattern previously when we looked at our narratives that we were sourcing from the community interface, where we had nextstrain.org/community/narratives, and then a username or organization name, a repository name, and then the name of the narrative. The same sort of pattern will apply for sourcing datasets from the community interface via GitHub. In this case, we can remove the narratives part of the URL and also update the name of the dataset that we're trying to load to reference a auspice JSON rather than a narrative markdown file. So to begin with, we can remove this narratives component. And at the end of the URL here, we can change this to match the file name of the file we just uploaded. We can see that the underscores in that original file name will get replaced with forward slashes, and I add this forward slash here just for convention. When I hit enter, this will now source the data from GitHub through nextstrain.org and display it as it was originally displayed on nextstrain.org. We can now use this data set in our nextstrain narrative to compare to the original data that was in our Africa focus tree. For example, we can now copy this URL and we can return to our nextstrain narratives interface in our repository. We can go to the top level directory and we can return to our specific narrative that we were working on. We only have a couple of slides in this narrative, so now we can add a new slide by editing the narrative and adding a new slide that references this data set. I'll scroll to the bottom of the existing narrative, and I'll add a header here that says investigation of early pandemic phylogeny for SARS-CoV-2. I can add the URL of my new data set here, and notice that this URL is sourcing from the community interface, whereas the previous URLs were sourcing from canonical nextstrain.org maintained builds. I can add some text here like this tree represents 24 strains collected in the first month of the pandemic. I can then commit these changes to save them. Scroll down to confirm that my link appears as expected. And then I can return to my community narrative and change this URL back to narratives/huddlej/nextstrain narratives demo, and then SARS-CoV-2 in Africa. This narrative is now still loading the Africa-focused dataset that was published on nextstrain.org. And as I scroll down, we can see the static content that we've previously added. We can see the circulation patterns in Africa. And now we can see the full tree, map, and entropy panel for this early SARS-CoV-2 phylogeny that we're sourcing from our own community dataset. In this way, you can create your own nextstrain analyses, upload them to GitHub in this same format, and include them into your narratives in this way. You can include multiple different data sets into a single narrative to allow you to make comparisons of how this virus has changed through time, and the same logic will apply for other pathogens.